Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. So I just want to get my stuff sorted up here. Sorry. You bought me water. Great. Thanks.
Want me on this side or?
Yeah. So, okay, we got. So I presume this is the clicker, right? Thank you. So our presentation is about fault tolerant in cybersecurity. Fault tolerance has many benefits besides cybersecurity. It provides active safety and a framework for autonomous vehicles. So we've been working on this for the last 4 years, and the beauty about this technology is that we can detect, correct, and heal anomalies in real time. So without further ado, let's go forward. Oh, it's the green one, right? Yeah. Okay. So a little bit background about myself and JP. I have 35 years of experience in mainly in communications, 5 years in automotive real-time cybersecurity. I have authored 17 patents on distributed computing, and 2 of those have been in fault-tolerant distributed computing, and which JP has been a co-author on one of those. JP has 15 years of experience in software development, including CAN, embedded systems, and distributed computing. So I won't waste any more time on that. And no cybersecurity presentation is complete with some basic stats, and I think everybody sees the bullets. Yeah. So the top one is very interesting. The recorded incidents is accelerating at an alarming rate, and this can be seen just by the fact that 1/3 of the incidents of the last 10 years have been in the last year. So we're on a rise there. And the third bullet is even more alarming because now cybersecurity crime is more profitable than illegal drug trade. So that will give them all the funds they need to essentially arm themselves with all the resources they need. So we have, in the cybersecurity field, we have a difficult task ahead of us to try to stay ahead of them. But we can take comfort, or I take comfort in what Carl Sagan has stated, that imagination is often carry us to worlds that never were. So without it, we never go anywhere. And basically what it says is that we have to imagine the future that we want and then go and build it. So, and in doing that, we have to basically learn what our initial our current state of the art is. So current state of the industry. So this is us in the vehicle, you, your wife, the dog, the kids, and you're driving along to the grocery store, and we come, and the car gets an attack or suspected attack, intrusion, and the car is connected. So what do? We send that up to what we call a security operations center, and the security operations center classifies that and then forwards that to the OEM. Essentially, the OEM looks at that and says, "Is this real? Yes, it's not, or yes, it is." And is it a policy change? Is it a firmware update? If it's a firmware update, it's a major undertaking. But eventually they'll get a fix and they'll push it back down, and the vehicle is secured. And that can take weeks, days, months, depending on the severity of the attack. Now, just to recap very quickly, our current state is that it's not in real time, requires network connection. The focus is on fleet management and suffers from false positives and negatives, and has many points of delays or failure. So back to Carl Sagan. What can we imagine? What should we be imagining as a cybersecurity objective? And so these are some of the requirements that we came up with. Obviously, we got to be able to detect attacks in real time, low latency. And this should also be absence of false positives or negatives, and the ability to correct all anomalies in real time. It doesn't matter if it's from component failure or a cyber attack. And it should be able to work independently of the SOC, and should be simple to use and have some self-healing capabilities. So our approach, after some brainstorming, was to essentially to come up with, what we came up with was a fault-tolerant distributed computing. So just trying to keep these in sync. So distributed computing is, so what is it? I mean, I'm gonna expand on this, and I'm gonna explain to you. It's a fault-tolerant distributed computing. It's based on multiple authorities. So what does that mean? Basically, multiple authorities means there are multiple entities that have authority to produce data. And these are services. So in this particular example, we've circled 3 C's here, which are providing service C. And every ECU in this scenario has what we called a voting system. And this voting system job is to collect the data from all the authorities, compare them very quickly. Low latency is the objective, and decide which ones are correct. So all the services put that data on the bus, and essentially the voting system looks at them and eliminates the outlier and passes the correct data through to the appropriate entity that needs the data. So let's just imagine that ECU2's got a component failure, or it's got malware on it, or something like that, and essentially by design, when you design this, you set a threshold on a number of anomalies you're willing to accept that you're going to correct before you essentially change things over. And once you hit that threshold, and in this case, ECU2 has just been producing garbage, it says its threshold, and we say, hang on a second, ECU2, you're producing too much garbage. We're going to remove you from authority, and essentially we're going to move authorities somewhere else in the network. And this is happening all in real time. So it was ECU1, and we decided it's going to be ECU4 in this particular case, and essentially ECU4 takes over that functionality. Again, all in real time while you're still driving, and you have the other two that are still doing the calculations. So let's just step back a second and look at this and realize what we have done. Very important is that we have changed the architecture of the vehicle in real time by moving a service C over to another ECU. The value of that is that a cyber attacker has to know what your architecture is to know what to attack. And if he doesn't have that, then he's chasing your tail, basically. And so that's pretty significant. Now, The other thing that you could do with this, now that we are able to move functionality C over to another ECU, we can also move F, A, and B, AF and D, and essentially take care of. So by moving those functionalities over to another ECU, we've actually cleared that ECU. And if you have malware on it, the only way we can get rid of malware for sure is to actually eliminate it by doing a complete memory wipe and a fresh software reinstall. So, and the only reason we can do this is because we have, in the last 20 years, we've progressed so much in terms of technology. CPU power is up, and memory costs have come down significantly. So just to recap, multiple authorities provides the services, and low latency voting system is required on every ECU. And one item that I don't have on this chart here, which is pretty important, is that this system also works with encrypted data, where machine learning systems will have a lot of difficulty to work with encrypted data. So moving on. So we had an approach of how we were going to approach this. So the next step was, well, how are we going to demonstrate it? How are we going to test it? So we had to develop our own application because, well, we picked steer-by-wire because we thought that was a cool application to use this technology on and demonstrate it. Excuse me. But nobody was going to give us a steer-by-wire application or a platform to do some of our own work. So we had to build our own. So we used a planar system, and the four squares you see on the edges are little screens representing the wheels. The big square in the middle, or rectangle in the middle, is a larger screen, which is your dash. And the circle below it is essentially your steering wheel. And anyway, so we've represented the vehicle with a four-wheel steer-by-wire application running on it. So the hardware we used was BeagleBone Black, essentially because that was available everywhere, and we designed our own custom clips for the CAN stuff and to drive the displays. And currently we've got Carleton University working on a 9-degree freedom for four-wheel steer-by-wire model. So we plan to continue on this. Now, the system on the right is our test system. So question is, how do we inject into this system? So we had to build a fault injector, or fault injector bridge, as it's termed, and we have to have a test management system. So we essentially injected the faults through the fault injector, and then we looked at, so the fault would get injected into the system. It would get detected by each ECU that was interested in the data, and the anomalies would get reported back to the test system through the IP side, through the Ethernet, which was available on the BeagleBone Black. So, and then we used to correlate the data because there's multiple ECUs that are reporting this. Remember, we got 3 authorities, and depending on how many people wanted to use or how many services was being using the data. So right now I'm going to hand it over to JP, who's going to talk about how to basically build the application and throw off some of the results. So, so JP, this is the green button. I can.
Thank you, Bruce. Hi, everyone. So I'll talk about what changes were necessary to turn a regular application into one that uses our defensive system. And Oh, we weren't on. We're on the right one now. Go ahead.
I'll take care of it.
So what we want to show with this slide is that our daemon, which sits in the middle, takes care of heavy lifting, and so that your applications that you will design don't have to, and then your designers can just concentrate on the core functionality that they want to implement. So at the top, the blue boxes represent the application code. And this is just one example, but you can have as many applications on as many ECUs or as few ECUs as you would like. And the way that this works is that the application, instead of talking directly to a bus or network, it just simply registers with the daemon for data that it wants to either receive or send, and also registers services that it wants to distribute. And then the framework can take care of timers for recurring tasks like sensor reads or also recurring services. The application hands over the control to the daemon and then gets called back through callbacks. So the daemon goes to work, gets the fault-tolerant redundant data from the network, validates it, reconstitutes it, and then it gives it back to the application via callback, and it looks like it was just coming from a single source. So this approach is similar to AutoSAR, and like I said before, your designers can just concentrate on the core functionality and not the cybersecurity details. So now let's talk a little bit about the validation strategy. So showing proper validation of this system has been complex and a challenging task, because when it does work and it does what we want, detecting, correcting, preventing attacks, then you can't see anything different on the system. So to be able to do that, we created some extra tools, created a tool for attack generation, one for recording and replaying inputs, outputs, plotting tools to be able to see visually the effects. And lastly, we can turn on and off the Defensa for comparison. So using those tools, we recorded 60 seconds of a driving sample, which you can see as the reference on the right there. And the x-axis is the time, and on the y-axis, we've got the positives would be turning left, and the negatives would be turning right. So in this sample, we just start going forward, turn left, turn right, and then bring the wheels back straight. Oh. Okay, and so using this replayable sample, we attacked it with various types of attacks, and now we pulled up some results from one such attack that I'm going to discuss. So we got the reference here, and on the right is the result. So what we see is that for 2 seconds, about every 10 seconds, we were attacking one of the steering inputs with extremely high values to turn to the extreme left. And then this was had the effect of turning the steering and the front left and right wheels to the extreme left. So I wouldn't be wanting to drive this car. And now once we ran the exact same attack with protection on, so the attack is detected and corrected in real time with nothing necessary from a SOC or anything from the network. Each ECU can do that, and so the driving experience basically ended up being the same as if there was no attack trying to steer completely to the left. So with the real-time protection of Defensa, your security is not delayed until there's a software hotfix, and it's available. You're protected in real time as it happens. We believe nobody else in the world does that. Berus, if you want to take it for the conclusion.
Thank you. So we're all familiar with this chart. It's you getting into a car with a wife, dogs, kids, and with fault tolerance now, the experience is totally different. Intrusion is detected, corrected, self-healed, and the vehicle is secure in microseconds. And but the car is still connected, so we send that information up to the security first, to the SOC, and that gets packaged and sent to the OEM for them to figure out why that happened in the first place. So, in summary, it's real-time protection, microseconds. The SOC still plays an important role here, but the urgency is removed, and but the SOC is also a smaller and less expensive experience for the OEM. So, in conclusion, fault tolerance is a powerful addition for the OEM or for you guys to your tool bags. It provides us with it provides detection and correction in real time, and does not suffer from false positives and negatives. It does the self-healing. It also reduces your development and integration costs.
You then actually executes the software, and this brings us to the topic of secure boot and the talk of Robert, who is entitled Sliced Secure Boot with Reusable Fingerprints. Yeah, and I would say I don't take any of your time and leave the floor and the presentation to you.
Okay, thank you, Frank. And I want to thank you all for welcoming me here. It's not just because it's nice to get out of my basement after 2 years, but have been active at the ESCAR events in the US, and it's the first time being able to come here to Germany for the ESCAR. So I don't think there's anyone here at the conference that doesn't think that secure boot is important for automotive controllers or isn't really a fan of secure boot. But I think when we look at it for automotive uses, we have some special problems that I think the traditional secure boot, like for an iPhone or a PC, doesn't really work very well. So I think with secure boot, we have three main objectives. The first is we want to verify the software code and the calibration data that it's really what's in there is what we wanted. We want to reach a certain level of assurance that we can trust it, and we want that to be done before the software is executed. And when we talk about the automotive, say, unique characteristics or requirements, we need to be compatible with the safety concept, especially for the ASIL-D rated controllers. We need to be compatible with the memory space, where many microcontrollers in a car have a megabyte of memory on chip, and that's all you get. Real-time system is another very important aspect to it, that we don't have the luxury of waiting a few seconds for operation to complete. It needs to be done, otherwise the car won't work. Also, because cars are inherently transportation devices, we don't really know the environments where they're going to be at, that they can be driven around, they could be in a tunnel, they could be in the desert or in freezing conditions. So the environments are very harsh, both say in the usage, and also for the attacker maybe has complete control over it and can isolate it from the OEM or the suppliers that are trying to protect it. And we also need to achieve a reasonable detection confidence. That perfect confidence is something that we maybe can't reach, but we want a reasonable level. So if we look at the secure boot, if we turn the key on or push the button, the hardware voltage stabilizes, your ASIC starts generating the 3.3, 5 volts, 1.8, gets the voltages stable. The microprocessor then responds to it. And then when it starts running, you can squeeze in the secure boot, and then you start running boot block. The microcontroller starts to turn on its peripherals. We do some built-in safety tests, initialization, and then with the COM stack, where we start sending out CAN messages to the rest of the vehicle. And the functional safety requirements for cyber physical systems limit when it's safe for us to act. And it's really that little window in red where the security appliance can have full authoritative control over what's happening inside the microcontroller. And outside of that window, or once we pass that, then it's not really safe for the security appliance to assert control over the safety appliance. So the question that we have, is there a way to accelerate the secure boot checks for safety critical ECUs where a traditional secure boot won't fit? And if you think about it, most microcontrollers say a second or two is not unreasonable for it to take to do the secure boot, and or to check the entire image. And we have maybe 50 milliseconds or something like that as a target to complete it in. A couple ideas that people have on there. I included this in here, but I don't want to go through it in a lot of detail because give some more time for some questions at the end. But what we can do basically to try to accelerate it is we can try and check faster, which is maybe the obvious solution. But if you need to increase it by a factor of 10, that's something that's going to cost a lot of money. And it's not just on one microcontroller, it's maybe on Kim, I think you had said 150 microcontrollers in the vehicle. That it's not just spending money on one part, it's spending money on all the ones that you want to do secure boot on. So it's really something that's very painful for the auto industry. We could check later, which means that we run the check after the system is already beginning to work. And I had mentioned before about the security appliances typically not ASIL rated. And even if it were ASIL rated, it doesn't really have the sufficient situational awareness to know what's going on in the vehicle. And you could be doing, say, a rollover mitigation activation as you're driving around the corner, the car starts to roll over, that if at that moment you figure out that the software is compromised, you can't just stop the event. You have to wait for the event to finish. So delaying the check until after boot means that you're actually not protecting this ignition cycle, you're protecting the next ignition cycle, which it is some level of protection, but I think a lot of people we're hoping for protection on this ignition cycle. The other option that I see is that we could check less. And if we do some sort of a statistical sampling that would be compatible with today's microcontrollers and also compatible with our safety concepts. If we do that though, the big question is, if we don't check every single cell, how sure can we be that it's safe? If we think about what our adversary can do, if we say our system is, we have a microcontroller that's outfitted with a hardware security module, and we assume that the adversary has full knowledge of the algorithm, that they know everything that we're going to do with the algorithm. They have the ability to control power to the ECU, turn on the car, off the car, or pull it out of a car and turn on the module, power on and off. And by doing that, that means that the adversary has control over the key usage or a key consumption. We assume that the adversary cannot access or control the HSM or the HSM protected memory. So we assume that that's still intact. And the adversary can tell if the image check passes or if it doesn't pass. So if you turn it on and it fails the secure boot, then they would know that. And then again, if we have any global keys that protect the entire fleet, that the adversary would be able to figure those out over the life of the vehicle. But if we have a module specific key that it's unique for each ECU, then that would be something that they don't know. And then if we think about a real world adversary, that they want to maintain basic system functionality. So if you have an engine controller, you still want the engine to work. You don't want it to just not power on, and then that would be easy to detect that if the car doesn't work or if the basic functionality doesn't work. but they want to modify the performance, say with an engine controller, get 50 horsepower more or 100 horsepower more, or maybe add new features or change the behavior. And if you assume that they're doing that, then the modifications would tend to cluster together. If you either are changing code, you need a contiguous string of code, or if you are changing the lookup tables, then they tend to be clustered together in that area around the lookup table. So this is maybe a different way for setting up the memory space than what we would typically use. But if you assume or look at that first cell where or the first image on the upper left, where if we say for the first row, we start with cell 1, 2, 3, 4, up to say 10, and cell 11, 12, 13, 14. And if we restrict our sampling, so we want to check one cell in each block, if we have a single sampled fingerprint where we make one sample, we check all those green ones, and then if we can say that if one of those green cells is checked, then we would detect it, or if one of the green cells is modified, then we would detect it on the boot. If it's only in the white cells, then we wouldn't detect it. And that gives us a good level of confidence that we can measure or estimate. But the problem would be is that if we try to reuse that key over and over, or that fingerprint over and over, that the attacker can just watch once and say, okay, I don't compromise any of the green ones. I put my modification in the white cells, and then that's undetected. You could think about improving that by then adding some more fingerprints, and then you still have the problem that if the attacker controls the consumption of the fingerprints, then they can see all the different fingerprints and then figure out their attack. The other concern is, or the other idea is, if we were to generate a whole bunch of fingerprints with maybe an uncontrolled, just randomly generating them, that some of the cells might be checked multiple times and some of them maybe checked just once, that still leaks some information, because if we're using the checks afterwards, that the attacker could say, like, those first two cells are checked twice as often as the other ones in that first row. So then he's going to avoid those cells and go with the other ones. And then he has an advantage of being able to escape detection more. If you think of the traditional secure boot one down on the bottom with a non-sampled exhaustive fingerprint, you check every single cell. The attacker knows that you're checking every single cell, but it doesn't really give him an advantage for trying to figure out which ones to try to modify. So if we look at the column-wise slicing, that this would be say the first pass at the idea that we make a slice of the memory and we check, say, all of the green cells and build a fingerprint based on a MAC off of those. And then we do that for the cyan, the blue, purple, and so on. And then at the boot cycle, we pick one of those at random and check the slice to see, are any of the memory cells in that slice compromised? And if not, then we would then proceed with the normal operation. The weakness with this one is that an attacker, if they know that we're using this algorithm, then they can say, well, I'm just going to try to cluster all my cells together, and you can change maybe 20% of the cells and only have a 20% chance of being detected. So what we tried to do then was to have this called critically sampled multiple fingerprints, where we still select one cell per row, and then we have a random pattern or put some entropy in how those cell fingerprints are built up. And a couple of things we want to, if you don't leak if you have a constellation that doesn't leak information, we would want to have exhaustive coverage so that there aren't any cells that are left unprotected. We want unbiased protection so that you have the same number of fingerprints that cover each cell, and you don't have some cells that are checked more often and some cells that are checked less often. And when we sample which fingerprint to use, we want that to be unbiased, so that when you check it at boot, it's going to be a random unbiased selection. and have some entropy in the pattern so that the attacker can't predict what the pattern is going to be. And this is just a run through of the algorithm for generating, where we would, at startup, or when we put the new software in, we check that the signature is correct. And then if the signature is correct, then we would generate the different slices of the fingerprints. And at the boot, we start up, we select randomly one of those fingerprints and say the red section is the part that's been modified. And if the fingerprint that we select covers one of those red cells, then we would detect it as being compromised. And if we don't, then it would pass or escape the detection. And then a third phase that we would do is, say, runtime detection. Typically, the way that people are thinking about runtime detection now is that you check the entire image, and then after that image is checked, then you say it's good. And if the concern, though, is that if we have the host core compromised, that it can say flood the HSM with high priority requests and say we need to check that the CAN message authentication code is correct, and it needs to be done in 10 milliseconds, and you keep flooding or requesting these high priority tasks, and the HSM never has enough time to complete doing the entire image check. So if we do this in small sections or take each slice, then we build our confidence incrementally rather than waiting until the entire image is checked. And I think that that's something that may, the value of this may increase in the future if we have different usage models for cars that are maybe they don't get powered up every ignition, or the ignition cycles might be shorter where you drive to work or drive to the store. It may be that if you have a robo-taxi that runs 24/7 and then you plug it in and get charged and it goes out and drives some more, that you may not be doing a boot cycle every hour or two, but it might be for like a week or two. And so to look at some of the math behind this, so how likely are we to escape or to detect this? I tried going from saying we had 64 slices. It's a number that was easy to start with. And I varied the number of compromised cells from 2 to 64, and then varied the length of the selection so that we have a total of 200 modified cells that are linked together with jumps. And if you look at it, it came out that about 25 or 26 was where we had the worst case for the escape rate. And then if you just take a random distribution of these things throughout the 8 megabyte memory space, that on the first ignition cycle, we had a 99% chance of detecting it. On the second ignition cycle, it was like 99.9 and then 99.95. So that on every ignition cycle, the confidence that you would get would increase, and the ability for the attacker to escape decreases. Now, if the attacker knows, though, that we're doing this with a sliced memory, that they would probably then try to craft their attack so it's not really easy, and make it or try to take advantage of the slices in memory and figure out where the slices are, and then try to shadow the additional changes in code so that they're not so that the number of fingerprints that are affected is as small as possible. So if we try to make some patterns that increase entropy, we would need them to be predictable, in the sense that we want the HSM to be able to reproduce the fingerprint pattern with simple calculations, and not to have to use the host core to do the difficult calculations. But we also want it to be unpredictable, so difficult to predict a pattern from outside the HSM. And we can also make it unique so that each ECU would have its own unique pattern. And if an attacker spends a lot of money, takes apart an ECU, figures out what the patterns are, and crafts an attack, that he can't scale that and use that on other modules or other products. And Then we talked about the memory usage. And if we have an ECU specific MAC key that was just like 16 bytes, if we use the fingerprints with these 64 slices that took up a kilobyte of memory, it's possible to store it in unprotected memory to be most, say, frugal with the memory usage. If we store it in the protected memory, that's better, but I think storing it in unprotected memory still offers a substantial amount of protection, because the attacker wouldn't know the secret key, so he can't, if he modifies the fingerprint, he can't, modifies the memory, he wouldn't know what to make the fingerprint to be. And then the real question that we had for the time reduction, we tried 2 different microcontroller families, Renesas RH850C, a D3, D4, D5 controllers within the Bosch world, that's what we call them. And we saw a factor of 23 improvement when we used these 64 slices. And we also looked at an Infineon TC37X and TC39X, and we saw a factor of 9 improvement on those. And those were sufficient to get us into the time that we were thinking of having about a 50 millisecond roughly that we could dedicate to the secure boot. Some of the parameters that we were tweaking with to improve performance, that if you check more memory, it gives you a little bit better factor. If you we were checking 1.5 megabytes to give us these numbers. If we checked like 100 kilobytes, then the overhead cost us more. We needed to optimize the cell size. So if you check with a byte versus a word, the bytes, I think, have a finer granularity for the security, but it takes longer for the hardware to process the bytes than it does the words. And then the buffer size that we dedicated to the HSM to be able to use the memory, that it was the only thing running at the time at boot, so it's easy to dedicate that. And then we also used the eScript Secure HSM as a to run the test. The first trials that we did were done on running in the host core, which didn't really give us the right numbers or the right measurements that we wanted. Then a question, how well does this work in a real world? It's very difficult to find published real world automotive attack data. And so what I did, I got contacts from someone within Bosch that had taken an engine tuner that was modified in the field, and we downloaded the software and compared what the software that the attacker had modified to do the engine tuner versus what we had originally put into it. The attacker modified 0.08% of the memory, so it was a very, very small amount of the memory was tampered with. And we saw with the slice secure boot coverage with just the simple columns, it had 100% detection up until 2048 slices. When it went to like 2050 or 2070, that's when it started to fall off a bit. So I think for that case, it was a very effective detection. But if we assume that the attacker knew that we're using slice secure boot, he probably would have sacrificed some of the performance in his tuning to have a better way of escaping detection. So I think that's one of the things that we would want to look at in the future. These are a couple of ways that you could do using modulo addition, modulo subtraction, or modulo multiplication that would give us some entropy in the patterns, but still have us allow us to meet the criteria of having the HSM be able to do the calculation independently. For the conclusions now, I think that the limitations on this, that it's verifying against the local known good state. It's not verifying against the manufacturer's signature. So there's something that we give up by doing that. It's not robust against single cell modifications. So if you had something like your JTAG protection turned on or off, that one bit, that's probably something that you need to check it every time. You can't rely on a statistical sampling for this security critical software. I say for the achievements, I agree that it's not intended for all applications, but for things that we have where we need a lean